Hello, listeners. Welcome to the first program in our series, Let's Learn History, which is produced for grade 8 learners and anyone else who has an interest in the subject. My name is Ronald Krotz. Today we learn about social and political organization, chieftaincies in South Central Namibia, and trends towards state formation. Please have a pen and a notebook ready so that you can make notes of the important points. And also, don't forget to take part in the quiz at the end of the program. At the end of this program, you should be able to describe the basic type of political organization of the major groups in South Central Namibia.
Anna, you know what? I often wonder why we have up to 11 ethnic groups in Namibia and why we don't all speak the same language or practice the same culture.
Yo, I think that would be entirely impossible because the ethnic groups that we have in Namibia originated from many different places in the world, and they each came along with their different cultures, languages, and ways of life. I cannot wait to hear more about this from Mr. Krotz.
Oi, good morning, class. Please sit down and be quiet. Oh, and why do you all look so worried and anxious?
Sir, we're actually discussing something related to what we are learning now. I thought all the ethnic groups in Namibia that existed in the past should be having a common language, culture, and way of life. But, Anna feels that shouldn't be the case.
Well, sir, I was telling Doreen, of course it's impossible because all the ethnic groups that came to Namibia migrated from different parts of the world, and they came with their own leaders, cultures, and different ways of doing things, so it only makes sense.
Good thinking, learners. That's a great way to start our introduction and clear your doubts. It is true that the different ethnic groups in Namibia cannot all have the same language and culture because all moved and met in Namibia. Doreen, can you tell us who were the first people that moved to Namibia?
The Sun people.
Excellent! But today we will only focus on the Herero, Ovambo, Nama, and the Oorlams, and we will mainly look at their social and political organization during the 19th century.
I just want to add something. When we talk about social organization, sir, does it describe the different ways in which people live together? For example, it refers to things such as people's work, family structures, religion, customs, and so forth.
I think I remember reading that the Herero, Ovambo, Nama, and Oorlam people each had their own customs and ways of living.
Good! Did you know that the Herero community mainly depended on land for survival? They collected veldkos, which are actually wild fruits from the veld, and hunted animals using homemade spears and bows and arrows.
Yes, sir, I remember that. And they had large herds of cattle which provided milk, and they could only slaughter and eat their cattle on special occasions, such as initiations, weddings, and funerals.
And surprisingly, the Herero community still has large herds of cattle today. It is said that the Herero community lived in groups called clans. But what are the clans and who ruled them?
A clan is a group of people who are related in some way or another. Each and every Herero clan was ruled by one chief or headman. And after the Herero community fought and was defeated by the Nama people in 1863, a single paramount chief was elected. Right. In the absence of any questions, we move on to the Ovambo community. Doreen, please share with the class what you have read.
Unlike the Herero people, The Ovambo community was ruled by a king, and the power of the king was passed down from father to son.
Oh, so what that means is that if the king dies, his son will become the king.
Exactly. And just like you see in the movies, a king was highly respected regardless of his age, and the ordinary people paid tribute to the king.
And the ordinary people would often give the king gifts and food as a way of showing appreciation for the king's life.
But does that mean that the king of the Ovambo and the Herero chief had the same power?
No, Anna, not exactly. The king often had more power in their communities, and they were helped by a number of headmen.
Hey, I can just imagine how nice that must be, paying respect to His Royal Highness. But was the position of being headman also inherited?
No, Jurin. The king chose his own headman, and one headman acted as the king's closest advisor.
Oh, now I understand, sir. Can we perhaps take a look at the Nama community?
Good to see that we are catching up quite fast. Well, the Nama community lived in groups. Some groups were small and others were larger in numbers.
My grandmother told me that the Nama people did not settle at one place for a long time, and that's why they did not believe that the people should own land.
You are right, Turin. And the most powerful people became the leaders of the Nama community. For instance, if you are good in hunting or powerful in fighting, the community will choose you to make you their leader.
You know, sir, I was always wondering, is it true that the Nama people were ruled by a chief? And later, when they joined the Oorlam group, their leader was called the Kaptein. For example, Kaptein Hendrik Witbooi.
Good. Now we move on to the Oorlams. The Oorlams were ruled by captain and a captain's raad. We also call it a council, and they originated from the Cape Colony.
Ah, I read that they were the most powerful group in the south central Namibia because they had guns and rode horses.
I think they also lived in smaller groups compared to the other groups.
Yes, learners. And lastly, the Oorlams made sure that they always had enough cattle for trading because they were always raiding cattle from other communities.
Ah, this makes sense now.
Okay, Anna, please summarize what we have learned today.
Today we have learned the following. We had different groups in south central Namibia that had a unique way of life. The Hereros were ruled by the chiefs and they had large herds of cattle that were only slaughtered on important occasions. The Ovambo community lived in larger groups and they were ruled by kings, and the king's power was passed down from father to son. We also learned that the Nama community lived in groups called clans, and they were ruled by chiefs at first and later by captains. And lastly, the Oorlam people were the most powerful and feared group of all because they had guns and they also used to raid cattle from other communities.
Thank you. Now, before we go, here is the quiz for the day. The Oorlam people came from A. Botswana, B. the Cape, and C. from Angola. Write a paragraph about the political and social organization of the Ovambo people. That will bring us to the end of today's presentation. From myself, Ronald Krotz, program developer Yul van Harte, and the Namcol production crew, thanks again for listening. Until tomorrow, take care.
This program was brought to you by NAMCOL with funding from the Ministry of Education, Arts and Culture and the Commonwealth of Learning.
Hello, listeners. Welcome to the second program in our series, Let's Learn History, which is produced for grade 8 learners and anybody that has an interest in the subject. My name is Ronald Krotz. Today we will learn about the establishment of German colonial rule in Namibia. Please have a pen and notebook ready so that you can make notes of the important points. And don't forget to take part in the quiz at the end of the program. Alright, when we reflect back in history and think about how Namibia was colonized by Germany, we notice that most of the people often think it was entirely bad with no advantages, right? I hope today's lesson will shed more light on whether the arrival of the Germans in Namibia was a blessing or not. At the end of this program, you should be able to, first, define the term colonial rule. Secondly, explain why the Germans came to Namibia. And lastly, describe how German colonization affected the different indigenous groups and their various rights.
Wow, guys, I'm so confused. On one hand, I really want to believe that the Germans coming to Namibia was good because they developed our country for the better. But I remember my grandma telling me a story of how they abused and raped people and stole Namibia's resources.
You are right, Rosalia, and that is why in history we have a choice, because some people will think Namibia being colonized by Germany was good because they benefited, while others might see it as bad because they were abused. I feel this will be an interesting topic, and here comes our teacher.
Good morning, class. Betty and Rosalia, what's your problem? Can you sit down? What seems to be wrong?
Sir, we were just having a discussion on what we are going to learn today. It is going to be interesting because I heard a lot of stories regarding the Germans that came to Namibia and what they did.
But I would just like to know what the term colonial rule means, because I have no understanding of my own.
Thank you very much. Don't worry. We will now get into the topic and that you'll see that is very interesting. Well, when we talk about German colonial rule or colonial rule, it refers to a system of government that the colonial power, like in this case the Germans, used to control Namibia.
Let me see if I understand. So in simple terms, we can say that colonial rule refers to how the Germans were exercising their rule in Namibia. Right, Mr. Krotz?
Very good, Betty. Now tell me, why did the Germans come to Namibia all the way from Europe?
Sir, I think it was because of our mineral resources. Plus, we have the Atlantic Ocean, which they don't have. And they probably wanted our marine resources like fish.
Aibo. My grandfather told me they came to Namibia to steal land for farming and settlement purposes.
Okay. Great contribution, guys. In addition, the Germans came to Namibia for different reasons, which are the following. They came to claim Southwest Africa, Namibia, as a colony and declare it their own property.
But Mr. Krotz, what do you mean by colony?
Please take note that a country which is being colonized by another country is called a colony. To continue, the Germans came because Namibia had good land for farming and settlement, as Betty indicated earlier. Rosalia, please add another point.
Okay, sir, I read that the Germans wanted cattle, since the Namibians had a lot of cattle that time. But does that mean that they traveled from that far just to come and eat our cattle?
No, silly. I believe they would export the cattle back to their country for selling. Did you know our Namibian beef is rated as one of the best beef worldwide?
Indeed, learners. The Germans also came because they wanted minerals like diamonds, zinc, silver, etc., and cheap workers to exploit and use them for their own benefit, such as getting raw materials for the Germans to send back to their country.
You know, sir, I watched a documentary a while back, and I learned that they were looking for new markets to sell and buy their goods. They had a lot of factories that were producing a lot of goods at the same time, and Namibia was a perfect place for that.
I can just imagine the whole situation back then. But does it mean that the Germans did not do anything good for our country?
Well, Betty, that brings us to the next objective, which is the impact of German colonization on the Namibian people and their rights. We will start by looking at the bad effects. Yes, Rosalia?
So, I heard that they stole fertile land which was rich in natural resources, and as a result, the Namibian people were given tiny, poor, and infertile land to settle on. That's not very nice.
And Grandma said that most of the leaders lost their leadership to the Germans, and they even stole the Namibian people's cattle.
Most of the Namibian people became victims of harsh treatments, beatings, rape, and killings, which was really bad. You know, I even heard that the Germans could even rape a wife in front of her husband, and there was nothing that they could do about it.
Yo. You know, I just hate the fact that after stealing the land from the Namibian people, it was not given back until today.
Yes, excellent points, you two. I see that all the points you mentioned were very bad, but don't forget that the Germans also did some good. Can you believe that? They built beautiful roads and railways that are still being used today. They built schools and hospitals. And most importantly, they were the first to bring electricity to Namibia.
I think I understand it much better now, sir.
Yes, I'm sure I'm gonna ace the next test.
Thank you for your contributions and interest shown in this lesson. Please enjoy your break time. Right. Listeners, now let's briefly summarize what we have learned today. The Germans came to Namibia for different reasons, such as obtaining cattle. They needed land for settlement, mineral resources, and to get cheap labor to work for them. The Germans' coming to Namibia affected the Namibians in a good and bad way. It was bad because they stole land and cattle, killed and raped people, and leaders lost their power to rule in the communities. The arrival of the Germans also affected the Namibians in a good way because they built roads and railways, they built schools and hospitals, and they produced electricity. Thank you so much. Before we go, here is our quiz for today. Name 2 reasons why the Namibians lost their land to the Germans. Secondly, name and explain 2 reasons why the Germans wanted to colonize Namibia. And that brings us to the end of our discussion today. From myself, Ronald Krotz, program developer Yul van Harte, and the Namcol production crew, thanks again for listening. Until tomorrow,
This
take care.
program was brought to you by Namcol with funding from the Ministry of Education, Arts and Culture and the Commonwealth of Learning.
Hello, listeners. Welcome to the third program in our series, Let's Learn History, which is produced for grade 8 learners and anyone who has an interest in the subject. My name is Ronald Krotz. Today, we are going to learn about German administration from 1909 to 1915. Please remember to have a pen and notebook ready so that you can make notes of the important points. And also don't forget to take part in the quiz at the end of the program. At the end of this program, you should be able to 1. Describe the establishment of German administration, and secondly, discuss how the German administration undertook to promote economic development.
Good evening, grandmother. Please tell me a bedtime story about our history.
Evening, Rosalia. Okay, my child. We will look at the situation of Namibia after the War of National Resistance.
I remember that the Herero and Nama community started the war against the Germans because they lost their land and cattle. They were oppressed and they wanted their situation to change for the better. And did that happen?
No, my child. The situation became worse because the Namibians lost the war and the Germans established themselves better in Namibia.
Really? What happened after the war?
You know, from 1909, 1 year after the War of National Resistance, the Herero and Nama communities lost even more land, cattle, and their lives to the Germans. The survivors even experienced the worst.
I heard they were taken to the concentration camps and prison where they were worked to death and hardly received enough food.
Yes, and you know some had to work for the Germans as cheap laborers, which attracted even more German settlers.
How did the German administration then establish themselves in Namibia, Grandma?
To ensure that they had total control of the country, they came up with the police zone. The police zone covered up to 60% of the total land in the country and consisted of land that was mostly rich in natural resources.
Is the police zone the reason why the Namibian groups or tribes were separated?
Yes, my child. The Germans created homelands for all the ethnic groups that were in Namibia. And examples are the Herero, Damara, Kavango people, and so on. They had separate places to live in because the Germans wanted to divide them so that they were easier to rule.
Ah, so what was the area outside the police zone called?
Those places were called reserves, and the borderline between the reserve and the police zone was called the red line.
Grandma, did the Germans have any rules and laws that the Namibian people had to adhere to?
Of course, my dear. The Namibians were not allowed to own land and cattle without permission from the Germans. The Namibians were also not allowed to enter the police zone without permission from the Germans, and they all had to carry a passbook to show it to the police at any time.
Ah, but that's so bad, because after all, the Namibians were in their own country and yet had to live such terrible lives.
I can still remember those events just like it was yesterday. But you know, the Germans also did some great things after the war. They started a settlement program on the land within the police zone, as it was very easy to acquire land.
Grandfather told me that the only places that were in the police zone were Rehoboth and Beersheba, but they were not controlled by the Germans. Why is this so, Grandma?
I think it could be that they did not have any interest in those areas. You know, being white was such a good thing those years, because the white settlers were treated very nicely.
I think it's because they wanted to motivate them to settle in Southwest Africa.
I agree, my child. The German settlers were given money to build houses, wells, and dams that are still being used in Namibia to date. The money was also used to buy breeding stock, inoculate the stock against diseases, and replace stock lost to diseases.
Ah, and more settlers probably arrived in Namibia because they saw a chance to become rich in Namibia.
Exactly. Oh, it's late now, child. Go and prepare for bed, please.
Thank you so much for the story, Granny.
Now, learners, just a short summary on what we've learned today. After the War of National Resistance, the Germans came up with the police zone. The police zone mainly consisted of natural resources and fertile land. The Namibians could not go into the police zone without permission from the German settlers, and they could only go there for job-related reasons. The survivors of the war had to work for the Germans, and most of them were taken to prison and concentration camps. They divided the Namibians in their different ethnic groups. The Germans ensured that they restricted and reduced the rights of the Namibians. Slowly but surely, the Germans started to develop the country and mostly the land within the police zone. Lastly, the Germans tried to work hard to develop the entire country. That's the end. But before we go, here is our quiz for the day. 1. How did the police zone affect the lives of the Namibian people? Explain your answer. 2. Why did the numbers of white settlers in Namibia increase so much? From myself, Ronald Krotz, program developer Yul van Harte, and the Namcol production crew. Thanks again for listening. Until tomorrow, take care.
This program was brought to you by Namcol with funding from the Ministry of Education, Arts and Culture and the Commonwealth of Learning.
Hello, listeners. Welcome to the 4th program in our series, Let's Learn History, which is produced for grade 8 learners and anyone who has an interest in the subject. My name is Ronald Krotz, and today we will learn about Negritude. Please have a pen and notebook ready so that you can make notes of the important points. And don't forget to take part in the quiz at the end of the program. Good. So, at the end of this program, you should be able to describe the term Negritude, to discuss how Negritude developed, and also, lastly, explain the link between Negritude and the Black Consciousness movement.
Good morning, teacher and my fellow learners. Today, my group members and I will have a short presentation on Negritude. So let me just give the first chance to Olga.
Good morning, guys. Did you know that back in the days, being black was the worst thing ever? The blacks were treated as inferior to whites. But today, black and whites are treated as equals, all because of the Negritude movement that was developed.
Fellow learners, please take note that the Negritude was a movement that tried to define what it meant to be black. The movement believed that all Africans should be united and ruled by themselves instead of being colonized.
And if I can just add to that, Negritude developed in Paris among West Indians. The father of Negritude was Aimé Césaire, and the greatest contributor, and at the same time the president was Leopold Senghor.
Why was Negritude developed?
It is important to know that the Negritude movement was developed because its leaders felt so bad to constantly see their fellow blacks looking down on themselves because being black was seen as a curse.
Yes, and to make it fun and easy to understand the new movement, Negritude was expressed in novels, poetry, plays, and in French rather than just long speeches in English.
Did the Negritude movement really help the blacks to have more confidence?
Definitely. And the Negritude movement tried so hard to convince the non-black world that the Africans made great contribution to the world and that they should be treated equally.
Most importantly, the Negritude movement wanted the Africans to realize that they should be proud of their culture and not feel worthless to whites.
Any questions on Negritude and the origin, class?
Question, Anna. Does it mean, due to the formation of Negritude, that the blacks thought and felt better about themselves?
Great question. Yes, the blacks had courage to fight for their freedom, especially for equal rights with the whites, and they started feeling good about being black, and they understood their value. That is why they decided to fight for their continent.
All right, it seems we're on the same page so far. How about we move on to the last point? This will be the link between Negritude and Black Consciousness Movement.
When we hear Black Consciousness Movement, it is closely linked with Steve Biko and Barney Pityana. The movement was started in the late 1960s.
I just quickly want to share a short story. So Steve Biko was a black South African that was trying so hard to make the black South Africans aware of their rights and to remind them about their purpose in life. He was expelled from university several times and he died in police custody after harsh and severe beatings because of trying to open the eyes of black people.
Sure, he was such a brave man. He even made the blacks in South Africa to realize and to know that black is beautiful and they should look at themselves as humans. Now the link between Negritude and Black Consciousness Movement is that they both strive to make blacks proud of their blackness.
Yes, and they both work together with other movements which fought for the rights of blacks, like Pan-Africanism.
Lastly, both movements work together with other leaders of Pan-Africanism like Marcus Garvey and W.B. Du Bois.
So, in conclusion, it is all thanks to those great leaders of the two movements that the black Africans were made aware of their rights, and as a result, they decided to fight for their African continent against colonizers.
Thank you, Olga. And that brings us to the end of our presentation. Thank you, class, for your attention and concentration.
Listeners, just a short summary before we go. Negritude came from a French word négre, which means dark-skinned man. Negritude worked tirelessly to make the black Africans aware of their value and rights. The father of Negritude is Aimé Césaire. The president and greatest contribution of Negritude was Leopold Senghor. Negritude and Black Consciousness Movement were linked in a way that they both worked on liberating the black people's minds and restore the pride of being black. Please take time to work on the quiz that follows. Explain the meaning of negritude. In what ways was the Black consciousness movement similar to negritude? The last question, what do you mean when you say black is beautiful? That's the end of the presentation. From myself, Ronald Krotz, program developer Jul van Harte, and the Namcol production crew. Thanks again for listening. Until tomorrow, take care.
This program was brought to you by NAMCOL with funding from the Ministry of Education, Arts and Culture and the Commonwealth of Learning.
Hello listeners and welcome again. This is the 5th program in our series Let's Learn History, which is produced for grade 8 learners and anyone else who has an interest in the subject. My name is Ronald Krotz. Today we will learn about absolute monarchs in France. Please also have a pen and notebook ready so that you can make notes of the important points. And don't forget to take part in the quiz at the end of the program. At the end of this program, you should be able to, firstly, define the term royal absolutism. Secondly, explain why kings obtained absolute power. And lastly, discuss how the divine rights of kings were widely preached. Good morning, class. Please sit down. Today we are going to talk about monarchs and monarchy.
Sir, did I hear you say monarchs? What are monarchs and monarchy?
Yes, Megan. Actually, it's just kings and queens, or kings and queens are called monarchs, and a monarchy is when a king or queen is ruling a country.
Wait, let me understand. So our queen of the Kwanyama people is also a monarch?
Yes, child. But we have different types of monarchies. We have a constitutional monarch and an absolute monarchy. Yes, Nicole, your hand is up.
I think I can try to answer this one. I think constitutional monarchy is when a country is ruled by a king, but they still have to follow the constitution, while absolute monarchy is when the country is entirely ruled by the queen or kings.
Exactly. Take note that a monarch's power is also called royal absolutism, meaning the kings would rule as they want and not have to follow the constitution.
But do we still have countries that are totally ruled by kings and queens?
Yes, we currently have 29 monarchies in the world.
So, sir, what type of power did the kings have when they ruled as absolute monarchs?
Well, they had the power to make laws and they could ask advice from the nobles, but they were not compelled to follow their advice.
Who were these nobles that you're talking about, sir?
They were the upper class people. The absolute monarchs claimed to rule by divine rights, which means that they could do whatever they wanted because they were God's representatives on earth.
But now I don't understand, sir. Who told them that they were God sent to represent him on earth?
I guess that's just a belief that was passed down from generation to generation.
Yes, to continue, the absolute monarchs controlled government decisions and foreign affairs. They made laws on religion, decided on tax, and they were in charge of justice.
I heard that some kings mistreated their subjects and could also decide who lived and who died without questions asked.
Yes, and apparently becoming king had nothing to do with age, as one could reign from a very young age.
I really want to know more about the divine rights that were widely preached, sir.
Very good. Divine rights of kings implied that they were God sent to represent him on earth, and as a result, the king had the power to make decisions, and no one was allowed to question the king, or it would be seen as blasphemy.
So, sir, does this mean that the people could not even overthrow the king?
Yes, and people who even attempted to do so or limited the king's power were charged with treason.
Was everyone then happy with the divine rights of kings?
Not at all, because the common people became even poorer as they had to share their profits with the kings.
Now, sir, could you please tell us why the divine rights of the kings declined and were no longer practiced?
Okay, since the kings constantly forced their subjects to go and fight in wars, a lot of lives were lost and people in the country became less productive, and as a result, the people started losing hope in the monarchs.
Okay, but were the kings really God representatives, and who told them that?
I think it was a belief that was practiced from generation to generation and later adopted.
Yes, good. Lastly, the main reason why divine rights of kings were declined was because great thinkers and philosophers came out and taught the people that there is no such thing as being God sent and that people should be given a chance to vote for their own leaders.
Wow! Thank goodness they saved the entire world from such practices, because I feel it is better when people live democratically.
Exactly. Thank you very much for your undivided attention. Can we please have Megan to summarize the lesson for us?
Yes, sir, I will gladly do that. Today we learned that kings and queens are called monarchs, and their rule is called a monarchy. We have an absolute monarchy and a constitutional monarchy. The situation where a king is totally ruling over everyone in the country is called royal absolutism. The kings were allowed to rule as absolute monarchs because they believed that they had divine rights. Divine rights of the kings were a belief that the kings were God sent and that they could make any type of decisions because God was happy with whatever they did. The people were not allowed to question the king's decisions, and doing so could sometimes mean death. The people paid great respect to the monarchs. Later on, divine rights of the kings were ended because the people lost hope in them, and great philosophers emerged and opened the eyes of the people. Today, we still have 29 monarchies in the world.
Now, listeners, before we go, here is the quiz for the day. 1. Define the term royal absolutism. 2. Differentiate between constitutional and absolute monarchy. 3. How were the divine rights of kings practiced? And that brings us to the end of the last presentation in this series. So, from myself, Ronald Krotz, program developer Yul van Harte, and the Namcol production crew, thanks again for listening. Until tomorrow, take care.
This program was brought to you by Namcol with funding from the Ministry of Education, Arts and Culture and the Commonwealth of Learning.